Today on Data Nation, we dive into the cutting-edge world of advancements in the aging process and brain health. As scientific innovation continues to unlock new possibilities, we wonder if things like your Oura Ring telling you your biological age is a bunch of hooey or real science, whether blood transfusions make you younger, and how we can ensure that this new healthcare is accessible to all populations. I'm Liberty Vittert, professor at Washington University in St. Louis, and my co-host Manzar Daleh, William A. Coolidge Professor in Electrical Engineering and Computer Science at MIT. Joining us for this fascinating discussion is Jeffrey Karp, author of LIT, Life Ignition Tools, and founder of the Karp Lab, which leverages nature for solutions in fields such as regenerative medicine. And Daniel Belsky, Associate Professor of Epidemiology at Columbia University and the inventor of the Dunedin Pace epigenetic clock, a tool revolutionizing how we measure and understand the aging process. Together, we'll explore the science behind extending lifespans, the role of nature and mindset in optimizing human performance, and the societal implications of research on aging. We'll also tackle how to make the innovations from aging research equitably accessible, ensuring those advancements benefit everyone. Jeff, I think I want to start with you because you have this LIT. Is that the right way? Is it LIT or LIT?
Yeah, Life Ignition Tool.
Life Ignition framework that, really, as you say, sort of helps us energize our brains, which I think everybody would like to do more of. So if you could just sort of give us a little bit of an idea of where the data comes from that created this framework and sort of where you see it going in the future, especially, with emerging technologies, AI discoveries that could really sort of revolutionize aging and health span in the coming decades. So our sort of the summary of LIT here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. The tools and the framework for LIT didn't come out of my laboratory at Harvard Medical School. They came out of the lab of my own life. And that's really how I generated the data. And it really kind of tracks back to when I was in the second grade and really experiencing a lot of challenges in my life in elementary school with undiagnosed learning differences and ADHD. I didn't know it. My parents didn't know it. My teachers certainly didn't know it. And I had some transformational experiences that actually happened when I was around 7 or 8 years old, just questions that I was asked that really enabled me to start practicing metacognition, thinking about thinking early on. And it was almost like I had this hardware, but I didn't have software that worked for me. And I needed to program that software through the power of observation, the power of observing people around me and how they behaved in different situations. And then I would use that to then try that on and see what works for me and what doesn't work for me. Many things didn't. And so that's how I essentially navigated life and developed tools that I use for initially survival, but then I use those tools to thrive. And I think that's actually, to me, as I sort of reflect on the current way that we're going about creating data, I think one of the big challenges is that we have this incredible power of observation and we have this ability, this incredible brain. Our prefrontal cortex is just ginormous, compared to most of the in the animal kingdom, and yet we're only using a small fraction of it. And to me, I think there's a lot more we could be doing to tap into what is internal to really help us navigate and to lead intentional lives and really develop technologies that can serve, but also, consider potential consequences as well.
If I may jump in, I think this is amazing, but I do want to understand a little bit better. I think what you're saying is that everybody has to engage a process by which we reprogram the way we're learning and growing and so forth, right? Because the one process that works for everybody doesn't actually work for everybody. And so, But the difficulty of this is, what is the mechanism by which I will find my own process? I mean, you were lucky that you discovered a way in which you could thrive and retrain. But to think about all the different possibilities that can be going on, and some of them are emotionally intertwined, and some of them are, genetically intertwined. It's so complex, and maybe I'll engage this process and go nowhere. how do I know that this is the path I should follow, and what do I do?
Yeah, great question. I think, well, first of all, I would say, we're all blessed with this evolutionary inheritance of neuroplasticity, for one, so the ability to rewire our brains. And it really happens whether you want it to or not, just by being exposed to different experiences, our brains constantly being rewired. And I think, we also have the power to create space in between stimulus and response, right? We tend to lead these very reactive lives, very algorithmic lives. We tend to absorb what we learn and then we just repeat it for the rest of our lives. And I think we're all really blessed with this ability to intercept patterns and to find things that truly work for us. And I think there's a lot of ways that we can do that. One tool that I use a lot is really just to press pause. So for example, I often have these back-to-back-to-back meetings. And what I noticed when I started experimenting with creating like a 5 or 10 minute break in between, and this is not an email break or a texting break or a social media break. This is a true, close your eyes or go for a walk kind of break. And what I noticed is that, anytime we have meetings, we're getting so much information. A lot of it's going into our subconscious mind, and our brain needs time to sync up, to process information and experiences. And so just taking small breaks, what I started to notice was that the person who I just met with would say something, and in those breaks, I'd be able to connect it with something somebody said months ago or weeks ago. And that could lead to a whole new project or a whole new conversation. And I wouldn't be able to do that lateral thinking had I not taken a break. We're constantly getting cues. Our bodies are very intelligent, our brains, our minds. We're getting cues from the people that we're meeting with. But if we're not taking time to sync up, then we're not taking the time to really figure out how to lead more intentional lives and get on the paths that are most fulfilling, where we do our most intentional work. And I would argue that I think a lot of the technology that gets released into society, it's challenged because the people who are releasing it haven't spent enough time sort of looking within and really trying to get on a path of an intentional life. And when you do that, it just filters through everything in your life, your relationships, your work. And so I think that we get these cues that help to guide us, and we have to be open to them. And we can't be open to them unless we find ways to pause and let them, kind of swirl through our minds.
Yeah, I fully agree with this back-to-back meeting stuff, and definitely the need to pause and reflect. Let me switch gears a little bit and ask Dan a question about aging. Actually, it's kind of interesting. Over Thanksgiving, we had a whole bunch of our friends over, and there was a big party. And my youngest son, who is 22 years old, was asking, among your friends do you think aged well, and who you think did not age well? And so we actually had a conversation about what does even that mean? What does it mean for the person? So there's a perfect question to give to you, Dan, because you develop biomarkers, but also we often look at people and say, this person aged well. And it's not always correlated to what happens to them in the future. Like maybe they'll die early or something. I don't know. We have anecdotal evidence. We don't know what the real data looks like. So how do we measure, and how do we start thinking about this question in a systematic way?
Sure. We address this question a lot. The answers are consequential when it comes to building measurements, because the measurements can only contain what we design them to contain, or we can only hope that they'll do that. You talked about successful aging, and I sit here in an aging center named after the founding director of the National Institute on Aging, Robert Butler, who thought a lot about successful aging and was probably most famous in this country for writing a book called Sex After 60. So, for him, successful aging meant lots of things having to do with the kind of life a person could lead, the kind of activities they could engage in. When we are studying the thing that we call biological aging, we're thinking of only a small part of that complete picture. So, for example, as we get older, a feature of successful aging might be the accumulation of wisdom, the capacity to make more judicious decisions in the future. That's not something that we expect to find in the blood chemistries or the genomics that we analyze from people, although it may have consequences for that biology, and we may pick it up peripherally in that way. When we're defining aging for those purposes, we're really thinking about the integrity and resilience capacity of different units of biological organization. So our cells, the tissues that those cells aggregate to form, and then the organs. And as we get older, all three of those levels of analysis begin to exhibit signs of deterioration. We think ultimately the root cause of this is entropy. So we think that with the passage of time, the achievement of organization programmed by our genetic code and maintained by the activity of all of our different cells breaks down. And we begin to see more errors in the construction of these biological units. We see more failures in their management of the stresses imposed on them by daily life. And we see a degraded recovered capacity following those stressors. So we more often get knocked off of our homeostatic starting point. We have a harder time recovering, and our recovery is progressively less complete. So when we're talking about aging, when we're developing biomarkers for aging, we're really focused very specifically on the physical deterioration of the human body. And to some extent, we're interested in how that deterioration is reflected in our cognitive performance, but we think of that as part of the physical substance of the human body, and less so on what are important dimensions of aging that are studied in the field of gerontology, like wisdom, like a sense of well-being, like happiness. But so we're very much focused on that physical integrity question. And the way we measure that physical integrity of the body is by developing proxy measurements of it, and then by using relatively crude data mining techniques to build models of those proxies from high-dimensional molecular data, whether that's DNA methylation or proteomics is increasingly popular these days, and there are many other omics that people are deploying in this field.
And sorry, and just quickly, how much of the animal data is incorporated in your study?
So the measurements that we build are informed by animal research almost exclusively in the sort of theoretical background for them, but not at all in their implementation. So in other words, we're not borrowing parameters that are estimated or defined in animal models. We're not using measurements that are coming to us because they've been identified as relevant in animals, unless like very peripherally they were identified in animals. So we will often begin with the kinds of measurements that your doctor would take of you at your annual physical. And some of those measurements your doctor takes of you at your annual physical because they were originally discovered in, let's say, rodent models of atherosclerosis or something. But beyond that, we're not really interfaced with the animal literature at all. Now, for your listeners who are familiar with epigenetic clocks and everything that's getting published about them, there's a ton of animal work now on these epigenetic clocks. The animal work has really trailed behind the human work in this way. It's a reverse translational effort. And the reason, of course, to reverse translate a biomarker of aging is there are things that we can do to animals that we cannot ethically do to people that can help us learn how we can manipulate this biology in ways that can build health span for people like you and me. So it would be really valuable if we had biomarkers that could go back and forth between humans and animals. Right now, we have biomarkers in animals and we have biomarkers in humans. And Steve Horvath is developing some epigenetic biomarkers that he says can help us go back and forth between humans and animals. And I think that's a sort of a really exciting frontier in the field. But where we run into challenges is that the techniques that have enabled us to build useful biomarkers of aging in laboratory animals have proven less effective in developing useful biomarkers of aging in humans. And what I mean by useful is a biomarker that is sensitive to an exposure history. In other words, it reflects the differences in living that have brought a person to where they are, and that is predictive of where they're going to go, right? So the number one thing this biomarker has to do is it has to predict health span. How long am I going to stay healthy and functional? And the biomarkers developed by comparing older and younger humans, which is the method that we use to develop these biomarkers in animals, have not yielded measurements that reliably do that in people.
Dan studies so much of these biomarkers. And Jeff, you talk a lot about how you can optimize the health that maybe could potentially have some effect on the actual biomarkers. So do you sort of see natural methods that can be applied to slowing aging and improving longevity in a practical way? I mean, is there data that has sort of shown, mind over matter, that mindset can actually have a real effect on this? And how would you measure that type of effect on someone's ability to either slow down their aging process or make them healthier?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think that the research shows that this capacity for neuroplasticity, our ability to rewire our brains, remains throughout life, even as we age. We can learn new skills, and the brain's constantly remodeling. And in fact, that remodeling, the mind turns into matter during the pauses, most of the time, when we're sleeping. There's also a lot of data that shows just spending time in nature can actually have profound effects. When we spend time in nature, our heart rate goes down, our blood pressure goes down, our general sense of well-being goes up. And you don't have to go into a forest to experience this. And in fact, just going for a walk in your neighborhood, you can get it. I mean, even some countries now are using prescriptions for nature, essentially. The doctors are advising patients to go out into nature as part of their therapy. And I think, one of the challenges is that with this kind of sedentary lifestyle that we all have, we all need strategies to get out. And I like to practice very simple, accessible rituals and practices on a daily basis. It's one of the things I do, which is like just super simple, is I'll walk around my neighborhood and cycle through my senses. Like I'll say sight and I'll look at the texture of the bark on the trees, and you can say sound and listen for the birds and the rustling of the wind in the leaves. And then you can say touch and you can feel your clothes on your skin and you can feel your heels hit the ground. And our senses is how we experience the world. And if we can keep at it, if we can keep doing this and having conversations with others about what are you doing, and we can continually resensitize our aliveness. And I think, we've known this for a long time, but just, paying attention to your sleep and what you eat and movement, all of these things can have, again, profound effects on our health and on our longevity.
And I think, Jeff, I think this is, in a way, it's incredible because everything you say is a great thing to do. I mean, I don't see a downside of it, right?
Yeah.
At the same time, I think, we are continuously bombarded by what other things we can do that will take us from the existing routine and will help us in X, where X is something in the future, like, thinking better or living a healthy life or, and so, I'm a TikTok user, sorry. And my TikTok, I mean, I find it fascinating, how many different proposals for different types of exercises I should be doing, and what kind of weights I should be lifting and how many hours I should be there. And then I also have, TikTok finds the things that you're interested in. It's an incredible device. And so sometimes I get this music from the 40s and the 30s that I've actually obsessed with. So I say, well, here I am, TikTok is energizing me, with different ideas and different senses and so forth. But my question is, how do we know that one thing has a causal effect on an outcome in the future? Is there like a randomized controlled trials here? Are we looking for real data that support a particular practice? How do we go around understanding this from a scientific perspective?
Well, there's been a lot of trials that have been done around foods that people are eating, sleep behaviors, nature exposure. There's like a ton of studies showing strong evidence of causation. But I think, to me, the key is sort of like stepping back and asking, what's the goal, right? Like, what is it really that you're looking for? Are we looking to live as long as we can, but at what expense? I like to sort of pause enough in my life so that I can determine what are the algorithms that I'm actually leading, right? And actually, if we just step back for a moment, I think it's really important for us to consider two things that we're up against. One is, for tens of thousands of years, we were hunters and gatherers, right? We were nomads. We were moving around in these small groups of people, and we were outside fighting for survival. And our brains would gravitate to a low energy state, and our bodies as well. It wouldn't make sense to go for a run to get exercise because we were already working hard and it was all about survival. So you wouldn't deplete energy in case you needed it to move or run away or, whatever it was. Same thing for our brains. Our brains gravitate into this low energy state because we're conserving our capacity in case we need it for survival reason. We're at a snapshot in evolution right now where that wiring still persists. We still have that primitive wiring that doesn't serve us anymore, most of us, And then on top of that, we have $1 trillion a year that are spent on marketing and advertising to hijack our attention and serve us algorithms of what other people define as important. What we should eat, what we should buy, what experiences we should engage, how we should look, how we should dress, all of these things. And so when you combine the two, that our brains gravitate to a low energy brain state, and we have this $1 trillion force acting on us all day long as we're on, spend time online, we start to lead these algorithmic lives, and they're not algorithms that we've defined for ourselves. And so to me, a big part of intentionality, the way I look at things, is how can we pause to reflect on what are the algorithms that we're leading that work for us and which are the ones that are not working for us, and really tuning into ourselves. And so I would argue that we know immediately if we take the time to pause and develop self-awareness of the cues that we're constantly getting, we know when we're on the right track. You just feel it.
Thinking on this same line of how do we know what works and what doesn't? Dan, I'm sure you're probably sick of hearing about this, but a huge press moment for aging sciences was obviously when the Kardashians, took have you seen this? Yeah, okay. I see your face. Took this biological age test for the TV show. And then, of course, there's sort of the internet famous, Brian Johnson, who's spending, a couple $1 million a month or something to try to reverse his biological age. And what I think, you get both from Johnson and from the Kardashian scene is, there's sort of this light on the concept of biological aging, especially to people who aren't immersed in the field. It's really, really exploding. And it's also sparked a lot of debate over whether these tests are accurate or not. So as biological aging advances and we get sort of more widespread discussion in the media, how do we know can you walk us through how one of these tests work? I'm a 33-year-old woman and all of a sudden I get a test back that says I'm, let's, hope, fingers crossed, 22. How does that work? What's the data behind these tests? Can you walk us through this?
Yeah, sure. Metrics of biological aging are designed to summarize the pace and progress of the accumulation of molecular damage that undermines the physical structures that allow us to live. And so with measurements like that, the construct is, this is how old we predict you are based on your DNA methylation. We can compare that to your chronological age. And if the prediction is older, we say you're aging too fast. And if it's lower, we say you're aging more slowly. The problem is that these clocks are interpreted based on their error in prediction. So I'm going to be 45 this year. If the clock reads out 40, I say, great. If it reads out 50, I'm not happy. But it's the error I'm trying to interpret. And we really need that error to be predictive of the kind of stuff I want to avoid or the stuff that I want to keep. And what we find with these clocks in humans, these age prediction clocks, is their errors aren't that informative about the future. And they're also not at all informative about the past. What we did in creation of our biomarker was something quite different. We focused on aging as a process of change. And so we measured indicators of organ system integrity, blood pressure, cholesterol, glycated hemoglobin, cardiorespiratory fitness, number of other things, at 3 time points in a group of 1,000 people who were all the same age when they were enrolled in the study and who were followed up at the same age when they were all 26, 32, and 38. Most recently, there was a 4th wave of data collection when they were 45, and that information is part of our epigenetic clock. But what we focused on were the changes in these different organ systems in these people. And we, instead of trying to predict how old a person was or how long they were going to live, tried to understand how fast has their body changed over the recent past. And so the number that comes out of our clock is actually not an age, it's a rate. It's the number of years of biological change you've experienced over the last 12-month calendar interval. And so rather than having an expectation of it being centered on your age, we want it to read out a value of 1. That's the average pace of aging. Values below 1 indicate a slower rate. Values above 1 indicate a faster rate. The clock we developed, which is called Dunedin Pace, is predictive of morbidity and mortality. It'll tell you what's going to happen to you, and it's sensitive to the kind of life history you've had leading up to the point where you take the test. And it was, for a while, Brian Johnson's preferred metric for his longevity Olympics. I think the Kardashians had it done when they worked with True Diagnostic to do their biological age calculation. So there are some promising tools on the horizon. But your original question to me was like, what should people make of these things? And the answer is, I think they are interesting. They may be fun, but they are not yet a piece of healthcare data like the clinical tests you get back from your physician. They are model predictions based on samples of people. They have not yet stood up to the scrutiny of thousands of people using them in their daily lives. We don't know what biases or artifacts may lurk within them and that could contaminate an individual's result. Now, that's true of essentially every biomedical test. So there's a way in which I'm holding these to a higher standard than we might to something else that makes its way into clinic. But this is the kind of information that I would look for about a particular test before I was going to change my behavior based on its result. And so today, we I think have adequate evidence to interpret these epigenetic clock biomarkers as outcomes when we're comparing groups of people. So when you run a clinical trial, you compare the treatment group to the control group. And on average, the treatment group looks different. You surmise that the treatment has had some effect. I think these biomarkers are now at the stage where we can interpret them in that context. Whether they work for the N of 1 clinical trials people are running on themselves, I think is in some ways a much higher standard. And I think we don't yet have enough data to be confident that they are accurate, or at least comparably accurate, for the many different people who may seek to use them.
But I think that, this is a great description. And I think, there are two sides to this coin. Right? One is looking at the distribution of these biomarkers, and tying it to potentially inferring an age or a rate of a change or something of the sort. And, ideally, you'd want to say people that live a certain type of behavior or they have a certain intervention have a distribution that is narrow, that is centered around, that the variation has been eliminated by this particular intervention. So ideally, I would like to say maybe run a predictor on how long I would like to live, right? And I would like to say a certain behavior will actually make 88, my death date, to be a fairly accurate estimate of when I'm going to die, right? And this is kind of like in our minds. But the problem is that these interventions we don't know what they are. I mean, I can believe all of these metrics that you developed for measuring the rates. But now the question is, what can impact all of this? And this is where, back to Jeff's argument of the marketing that is coming at us from, people are drinking 100 pills a day for different things to affect these biomarkers. They're taking vitamins and they're taking protein and they're taking, fish oil and there's a whole list of things, right? And then they have to exercise, so they go to exercise, and then they're doing all of this stuff that is expensive and time-consuming and keeps on changing, right? And in fact, now we are seeing all these billionaires who are spending half of their fortunes so that they can live a little longer, And so for us, the people that are not engaged in this research, I think the question for us, what do I do? Now, I like Jeff's answer in that there are some good practice, good things that you can do. It's unlikely that there is a downside for me to pause and think. Unlikely that there's a downside for me as I'm walking to look at a tree and enjoy or think about the flavors of my food. I mean, those are good things, but maybe having too much magnesium can kill me. I don't know, so that the pills that they keep telling you to have can kill me. I don't know. I don't trust it. And there's an industry out there that's trying to make a lot of money. So how do we respond to all of this? I like what you said, Dan, that this is in the research space right now. You're thinking about it from a research perspective. But I think that message, should we amplify that?
Yeah. So, I think one of the things that has enabled people to make the kinds of claims that they've made about these putative longevity interventions is the absence of any standard by which they could be evaluated. So it takes an awful long time for humans to age. We could do some nutritional supplement or some sonic therapy or cold plunges or whatever it is. But we'd have to wait 20 or 30 years to find out whether that intervention actually changed aging. And because we can't do that, and nobody expects them to do that, the intervention promoters get a bit of a free pass. So one of the things that biomarkers of aging have the potential to do in this space is enforce some discipline on the claims that are being made about the supposed effectiveness of these different interventions. In terms of what people should do, I think that concentrating their attention on changing behaviors that have been the subject of rigorous controlled trials is a good place to start. And I have essentially no objection to anything that Jeff outlined as how we should live better. And when people ask me, what should we do? It's kind of like, well, I don't have anything new and exciting to tell you, right? Like eat less, move more, eat food, mostly plants, not too much. The kind of Michelle Obama meets Michael Pollan gets you most of the way there. Sleep doesn't get included in either of those, critically important, as Jeff pointed out. And, you mentioned, Jeff, engagement with nature as something we see increasingly evidence for as a regulator, in particular of our stress response. So what people are able to observe when they put folks in the woods is that all of these biological systems that are activated by urban environments, and we're sort of wondering what's going on around us, we're attending to it, that those are downregulated.
So I'm not hearing blood transfusion as part of the list.
Yeah, I'm not going to suggest parabiosis. But I think what I would add to Jeff's list is not just interaction with nature, but interaction with other people. Social engagement, meaningful social connections are characteristic of the lives of people who enjoy many, many years of health. We don't have the randomized trials yet that would establish that is an intervention that would prove effective, although we do know that isolation is deadly. This is very clear in laboratory animal studies, and I think we have accumulating data on humans. So we can add to Jeff's list maintaining social connections with others. But in terms of all of these more exotic therapies, we don't have the evidence yet. Biomarkers of aging, as they mature, will give us the means of adjudicating which of them are most likely to be effective.
Yeah. And maybe just one thing to add to that. I mean, I think that the biomarkers could really help motivate people to make lifestyle changes. I mean, I think we really have a decision point, almost like a fork in the road kind of thing in our society, where we can use these biomarkers as they become more rigorous and more demonstrated and more support for them. We can use them to help motivate people to make these behavioral lifestyle changes that can lead to preventative based measures. Or the other side is we could fuel this entire sort of, supplement industry and all of these experiences, which I think, can be great for a lot of people, but I think that you can get a lot of the same benefits just from natural sources. And so, we really have this kind of bifurcation here. And it seems like, the way that the world works, at least today, is kind of moving towards paying for what we could actually be getting naturally. And so, and I just think that we need to really think critically and not get lost in the shuffle of always moving to a supplement or always moving to a drug, because ultimately they have side effects. And as one of my clinical friends tells me, there's a lot of people out there who have very expensive urine.
We've talked a lot about what are mindset changes people can make. How do you do biological markers for an individual person? Looking towards the future, are there cultural things that have happened? I mean, are there countries that are doing this a lot better? We hear about the blue zones where, a large group of people live a lot longer. Are there real success stories out there that we should be copying?
I mean, success stories in terms of building societies that are friendly to an aging population. It's, again, sort of stepping outside of the work that I do day to day, measuring the biology of aging in free living people. But we do keep an eye on this. And I think one of the standouts globally in terms of building what we here in the Aging Center and my colleague Jack Rowe calls an age-friendly society would be Singapore, where they're really redesigning much of their public infrastructure around the idea of an aging population and how to maintain health, social connection in a population that is getting older. There are other questions around healthy aging, like we talked about. There's variability to some extent in the way that physical activity is built into daily life, or a healthy diet is engineered by social policy. And I think that there's a lot of interest in trying to study how different public policies are impacting aging at the population level, but we're still at the beginning of that.
I would just add to that that there are some jurisdictions around the world. There's some countries that I think are really progressive in this space. Japan, for one, is really known for high life expectancy, and they encourage a balanced diet that's rich in vegetables and fish and fermented foods, and regular physical activity, strong social connections. So I think it is definitely ingrained within the culture. And I think Sweden as well, they prioritize accessible healthcare and active aging policies and various sort of urban designs, and the blue zones that you mentioned, like Sardinia and places in Costa Rica and other places. And I think there's some real commonalities in here, this deep sense of community and nutrient-rich diets, and really actively in an intentional way reducing stress, and doing it in a culturally accessible, and supported way.
This was great. Thank you so much for all your candid answers.
Well, so I have to say I'm a little bit disappointed to not just hear that cold plunging is going to make me be 20 years younger.
Yes, I do take cold showers as well, and I feel good, so it doesn't matter.
So it's the mindset concept. I loved what Jeff said about the mindset. I'm not sure if I'm convinced yet that there's evidence behind that, or did you see that, or how do you feel about that?
I think what Jeff is talking about is an algorithmic solution to issues, right? And so in engineering, we have this notion of persistence of excitation. If you want to learn a system, you have to excite it in a lot of different ways. Otherwise, you only see one thing. And what happens with routine, and I always say routine is a two-sided weapon that we have, because the routine basically makes you very efficient in doing the same thing. But it does take away the variability and the persistence of excitation. But then it's inefficient, right? And so we are struggling in this world. We get into a routine and we do the same things because it's very efficient and we can get the job done, but we lose that. So what Jeff was talking about is say, well, don't allow the routine to take over your life, because you have the ability to be a lot more creative and think differently if you continue to persistently excite your brain. And that is, pay attention to the things around you as opposed to just keep looking in one direction because you're being efficient. So his methodology is a methodology, right? There's no downside to it, because by observing everything around you, by appreciating things around you, there's nothing wrong that can go because you're doing that. You may lose a little bit on the efficiency, but we all know that this efficiency is a construct we created. I mean, it's not true. The fact that you work 5 hours in a row, listening to people on Zoom, it doesn't mean that you are 5 hours productive. It's absolutely not true. We all know that, right? So that's what he was advocating. So that part, I don't have a disagreement with, because it's a method, and it's a best practice for how to keep your brain active and running. And I think it's a great lesson. And so, we see it all the time. We tell the students, read a paper, but think about it. Don't just read and go jump to the next paper. Try to think about what you would tell people about the paper so that you reflect. And when you reflect, you have other understanding. The biomarkers work, in my opinion, is very rigorous, and they're trying to come up with measures that are statistically significant to the extent that they can. 1,000 people is a small sample, but at least it's a sample, and you can try to build a distribution around those people and see what happens. And what's nice about this podcast is that neither one of them was selling a particular product. Both seem to not say, these are the different things that you have to do, and blood transfusion didn't make it to the top list of things you have to do. And especially from kids. And we didn't even get to the ethical issue, but because they never really advocated that. I think they were very reasonable, and I think maybe kind of restored a little bit my belief that there's some good research that is ongoing in that field.
I know. I wanted to be told to take magnesium pills and to take this and this. I was ready for that.
The gluten or no gluten, the magnesium. I was telling my friends the other day, it was kind of funny as we were having this conversation. And now at my age, you're young, but at my age, this conversation dominates. It's really the thing.
I give my dad 5 minutes. He's allowed to talk about his health for 5 minutes.
And I don't take anything. I don't take anything, right? And part of it is because I'm lazy, and part of it is because I have to figure out exactly what this thing is benefiting in. And so then all these people were talking about the exact measurement of the magnesium is that this much can kill you, but this much is so much important to you. And I'm like, why are you guys taking magnesium? Like, what did I miss?
You mean the hunters and gatherers weren't taking magnesium pills?
For a while I thought it was calcium, but now it's a different element. So I don't know. I'm behind.
Well, I think it's going to be a really interesting thing to follow, and I think especially given the media attention that this kind of stuff is getting with the Brian Johnsons and the Kardashians, and I don't have TikTok. I do not have TikTok, but I do have Instagram, and I just got targeted for come take a scan of your body that tells how old you are and what what vitamins or what nutrients or whatever you need to take to reduce the age. Right. So I think it's going to become more and more a thing as time goes on.
You're too young for all of this stuff. Wait until you
I'm sitting here. Look, I have these. I'm taking these every night, but now I'm going to stop. I don't need to take them anymore. Save myself some money.
Exactly. Yeah.
All right. Well, we will be back next month with our newest episode, and we are diving into some really interesting concepts with the NCAA, with name, image, and likeness, with betting, with how sports are really affected and how data is changing the entire world of sports, whether it be American sports or international, with soccer, or as aptly named, football. And we'll get diving into that in January.
Fantastic.
Thank you for listening to this month's episode of Data Nation from the MIT Institute for Data Systems and Society. You can learn more about IDSS and listen to previous episodes at our website, idss.mit.edu, or wherever you get your podcasts, or at Liberty Vittert or at Mansour Daleh. Thank you to our producers, Tina Toby Mack, and assistant producers, Ben Stoll and Maria Burks. Don't forget to leave us a review and follow our Twitter at MIT IDSS to stay informed. Thank you again for listening to MIT's Data Nation.